ladder of capability who might be a sergeant, a first sergeant, a command sergeant, a sergeant major, a command sergeant major. And those are the folks who deal with order and discipline within the ranks. The officers, which if you want to become an officer, as Daryl said, you basically go to what we used to be called officer candidate school or 90-day wonders. They get a degree or they're in college. They'll either go to a military academy like West Point or Air Force Academy or something, and then they come back and they'd be commissioned as second lieutenants. Now they're commissioned directly from the President of the United States, whereas all the enlisted people gain their rank and grade upgrades directly through the Department of Defense. So, but it's they both work for the President of the United States, who's the Commander in Chief of the Army. It's just that, or all the armed forces. It's a parallel track. And here's the real importance of it. Between the First and the Second World Wars, and certainly during the Second World War, the armies learned quite a lot about resilience, and that is because, like no other career, you're going to put all these groups, enlisted men, NCOs, and officers in the field with the specific knowledge that some of them are going to die, right? So the resilience that is built into all NATO and Western armies to this day means that you're always doing your job, but learning the job above you. And periodically, when I was doing my basic 2 years in the Army and 4 years in the reserve, I left as a sergeant because I basically had to grow up to that rank. Otherwise, I would have got no upgrades, whatever. But basically, once you learn how to do what you can do, then occasionally you might have to sit in as a squad leader or serve as a squad leader. And then if you're decent at that, periodically, you might have to serve as a platoon sergeant and things like that. So that you're continually learning the job above you so that you can replace the person above you if they get killed or injured and taken out of it. So you're continually refreshing your organization and expanding its experience that allows it a resiliency in time of war that is not capable of being maintained in relation to the old style, which is the Soviet approach, which is a massive class separation between officers and enlistment people and the amount of information that's shared. When you're going to go into a battle, the officer spends days and days and weeks getting information about what's being planned with the other officers up the chain of his command, and the NCOs and the platoons and the companies won't necessarily hear anything about that until they get a thing called a warning order. Now, a warning order comes out, and that tells you to start getting ready to carry out a specific activity. Now, what happens when a warning order is issued is the NCOs start getting quite a lot of information, and this doesn't happen on the Russian side, right? You would see from what happened early on in the attempted 3-day takeover of Kiev, that the soldiers were literally entering the territory of Ukraine and didn't know what they were doing until the day. What happens in the army that I served in, and this is the 80s, so early 80s, so it carries on to today, and it's even better than today. As Daryl said, the NCOs primarily worry about readiness, discipline, and capability of carrying out a function, and the tactics of doing that, whereas the officers are primarily worried about the strategy of what's going on. But the bleed over in having a platoon sergeant and a platoon leader in an officer in that combined role is that the warning orders come out, and the platoon leaders and the squad leaders, the platoon sergeant and the squad leaders get enough information that, in fact, if the officer was killed in the first 20 minutes of the battle, whatever they were doing, they could carry on for a period of time and carry out the function that they're supposed to do, because they've got a lot more knowledge about what they're doing and where they're going, not just the first milestone they're supposed to reach, but how it fits in, at least basically, to the overall strategy of what's going on. So that capability in and of itself, which is what happened in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, what happened after the invasion of Crimea is NATO and some of the other Western countries sent a bunch of training advisors into Ukraine, and this is well documented, well knowledge, and the evidence of it is seen on the battlefield, that they started to convert the Ukrainian military into the NATO style of military by filling out these NCO corps, which meant that in small unit tactics, like what was taking place early on in this war, Ukraine was incredibly successful at carrying out small unit tactics because they were led by trained, competent NCOs, which I will remind you also were combat veterans because of the 8 years that they'd been fighting and being rotated in and through the Donbass region with the invasion, well, with the occupation there. So the difference that you see starkly and in great detail is that unit cohesion, unit morale, and unit readiness is significantly better under the NATO model of NCOs. And this is why you see people panic and run, right? T-80, brand new T-80 tanks that were coming into Ukraine from the north were abandoned up in the north and northwest near Bucha because the first shots started being fired. They first got into difficulty. They weren't really great at their skills of driving their AFVs or tanks. So they literally hopped out of perfectly good tanks and hightailed it to wherever they thought was safe. So that's the kind of indicator that you see. And the other indicator you see now is down in Soledar and Bakhmut, that the manner in which they're using troops down there demonstrates that they don't have, in most cases, competent, experienced, middle level NCO type people. They're just using their officers, and the officers are staying in protected positions and sending these troops out to the slaughter with, as Chuck has said, a map on a phone and or an iPad, and they're calling in, following them with drones and kind of poking them forward on where they went, where they go. They don't necessarily know how to do any of the tactics in which you take a machine gun position, reduce a concentrated enemy inside a fortification. They don't know and practice and learn any of that stuff because they don't have an NCO corps, and they haven't since forever. And the officer corps has been hollowed out over time. The Soviet Union led into Russia. As you see, the officer corps has been hollowed out and been subject to the corruption that you see throughout the society, and results in there being a very ineffective fighting force as soon as you're able to take out any of the officers. And this is why I've been counting this very same tally that Daryl pointed to in relation to generals and colonels and second and first lieutenants right down the line. And then the only other thing that Daryl said that I'll also clarify is warrant officers are a special case, right? When you want somebody to fly a helicopter, like in the Air Force, officers always fly the planes, right? Because it's a specialty discipline, and they always use officers to do it. Whereas in the Army, if you have a specialist function like flying a helicopter, because that's not really a Army sort of thing, but it's definitely an Army supporting piece of kit, and the Air Force kind of didn't want it, but they needed a special role that they could thing that. So this is where your warrant officers in the Army come up, and I don't know if they use them in the Marines or not, but warrant officers are specialists that do special things like fly helicopters, fly Chinooks, fly attack helicopters, and there are probably some other specialist roles that warrant officers fill, but they're not commissioned officers. They grow out of the ranks of people who were in the NCO area or in the enlisted ranks, get a level of specialty, find a role that they want to move into that is a technical specialist role, and then they get commissioned as warrant officers because of their skills and capability of that specialty. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Yep, but right on point.
It was really helpful to me, Will, and it actually came right up into the question that I was going to ask, which is, we've had 8 years for this kind of reorganization of the military in Ukraine, and my question was, well, how has Ukraine integrated this this ladder of yeah, of competency, because that's what it is. It's competency gained from experience, and we can see they've been successful because of how they're performing on the battlefield. I guess so. In other words, the Ukrainian army now is a kind of mirror of any Western or NATO army on the ground, uh,
It,
right?
at this point, you would have to say equal or better because of their combat experience. Look, I would argue a little. Well, I would clarify a little bit what Daryl said. I wouldn't call Afghanistan, Chechnya, Ingushetia, Georgia, any of that. The last time the Russia actually did combined arms warfare, the way that they need to do in a war of attrition like this, was World War II. Frankly, they have never fought. A combined arms attrition war in Afghanistan, Chechnya. You know, it's all what do they call hybrid, an asymmetric warfare. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that when you're trained by a person who's got the scars of several stab wounds and bullet holes in him, and is the biggest, meanest looking son of a bitch you've ever seen in your life as a 17-year-old in basic training, getting uh, getting taught how to do basic combat operations from a veteran, a combat veteran, you pay attention like nothing else that you've ever paid attention to in your life. They have a credibility that is, and so the training in the Russian side is unmatched on the Ukraine side because they've used this model of NATO and the West and learned how to build a resilient fighting force that can not only um, do the job better, but do the job better under adverse conditions that start to go against them.
So, here is the broadest question I can possibly ask. Why would Western command diverge so clearly from the Russian command structure? I mean, the Russians fought in the same war, World War II, that the Western armies fought in. How could their a command structure be so different and so deficient? I I I just don't understand.
Well, the answer is what Daryl alluded to before. You learn more from your mistakes than you do from your successes. And the truth of the matter is, like it or not, the manner in which the uh, Wehrmacht in the Second World War, they pioneered this resilient learning a job above you doing that. They actually pioneered the approach that NATO adopted after the Second World War. So you learn a lot from your mistakes, and the United States learned an incredible lot, as did the rest of the NATO countries during the Second World War, and Russia did not because Russia's arrogant, right? Russia has been a nationalistic, imperialist, authoritarian aggressor in its entire 1,000 years history since Ivan the Terrible formulated basically established the country as a nation state. They're and they reckon they're better than everyone. Look, there have been 7 periods in Russia's history where it has fought a war against an enemy that it should have been able to defeat much easier than it expected. It's lost those wars. The army has returned home, and the current ruler has fallen. In fact, it's happened in the Crimea before in 1300 or something like that. A war historian will tell you more accurately, but it happens time and time again, and they don't learn from their mistakes because of arrogance.
Well said, Will. Thank you very much for coming up. Uh, this might seem like an arcane discussion, but it really isn't. It has an effect every single day on the battlefield in Ukraine because of the difference between Ukrainian command and Russian command, and the difference means that Russians are they're more susceptible to,
They're less professional.
They're less
It's a less.
professional, Daryl. Yep, you're right.
The Russians have a less professional army in that sense. They may have generals, they may have lieutenants, they may have all of that, but they are not professionals in the sense
And
that when we train our officers, they are true professionals because they have learned their craft.
and the other, I'll just add, and then you better get Mark up, because so the other thing I'll add is, in the West, liberal democracies tend to beat the hell out of each other and ourselves over the bad stuff we do, because the world, smart people in the world are full of doubts and idiots are full of confidence. And the after 2014, when the little green men managed to take over Crimea, the West, including Australia and other, were kind of poo-pooing and making fun of the fact that all NATO did in response to that was didn't send any arms, didn't arm Ukraine, but they sent in all these advisors. And what's a couple hundred advisors going to do? Well, I'll tell you what, a few hundred advisors rotated through there. They were able to transform Ukraine's military into the fighting force you see today just by focusing on the NCOs. So, we beat up Germany for what it's done in relation to leopards and things like that. Liberal democracies don't get anywhere clearly, quickly, and it all seems confusing like a big mess until it gets there. And then they're the best, most resilient, most learning from their mistakes, best armed, best quality. It's night and day between what you see in the world of autocracies that bring to the field. Remember back in the Iraq War, when the big scare was going up. Oh, United States is taking on the third largest standing army in the world. Yeah, but the big difference is 300,000 troops was the biggest standing army in the world. But that's just bodies. That's not bodies that know what they're doing, and that's not bodies that know how to work together. And that's the big difference. But having said that, never, never, ever underestimate your enemy. And that's what we do, and that's why when this war comes to an end, nothing's going to happen for quite a while. We'll all get tired. We'll all be beating each other up. We'll all be pissing and moaning about what's going on, and then it's going to happen so fast and so fiercely that it will shock who it's supposed to shock, which is the Russians on the ground in Ukraine. And it'll take a while to get there, but it will be over quickly once the real battle is engaged. You better let Mark up.
Mark, you got called out.
Thank you, Darryl. Well, follow that. I think if I was to answer Alan's question, why didn't Russia adopt the same structure as the Western nations, I'd probably say one word, and that may be Stalin. I think in Russia, it's probably the fear of too professional, too powerful military, the threat that may pose to the ruling elite there. So that could be a reason why they didn't adopt it.
That's also 100% true. If you look at Stalin's history, he periodically and regularly would purge the military in order to eliminate threats to the autocracy.
Yeah.
And that's 100% correct. That I think that has a lot to do with it too. A competent military that is a credible threat to the leader of an autocracy is not something that can stand for long in those organizations.
Yeah, and it's worth saying. Sorry, Dan.
Oh no, go ahead, Mark, and then I'll.
I was just going to say that when Stalin purged people, it was not a nice thing at all. So yeah. But can I come back to perhaps the more general situation? I was going to comment about warrant officers and what have you as well, but probably think we better move on.
No, we here. May as well.
Well, all day.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I've never served, but except at my school, we had, when I say school, I mean, from between the age of 12 and 16 or thereabouts, we had some schools in the UK have what they call a combined cadet force. And you either join the Navy bit or the Army bit or the Air Force bit. And I was in the Navy bit for a while. it's a bit unusual, maybe, but it's more the private schools, the fee-paying schools typically do that. More of those do it. I went to a non-fee-paying school, a regular state school. But I have a bit of knowledge around the RAF more than any other branch of the services. And certainly there, the warrant officer is seen, that's the most senior non-commissioned officer rank. And that person is seen essentially as God. All the officers will defer to that person because that person has been there, done the job, knows everything inside out. So, and I think we, as I say, probably done it to death, but the officers provide the leadership, but the warrant will, and the other NCOs, they have the knowledge, they will run the ship and get the job done. But can I go on to perhaps the more general point about the current situation in the Bakhmut and the eastern part there on the front?
Yes, by all means, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a worrying situation, and I've no doubt Chuck will cover that in detail tomorrow. I don't want any more Ukrainians to die in this war, and every time we see, there's another offensive by the Russians, whatever, we know that means there's deaths, there's injuries, which is horrendous, and I don't like it. Obviously, don't like it at all. But I almost want to see what's going to happen, because if they do try and break through after this grinding type of advance they've been doing, I want to know if they can do it. Given their amount of vehicles, tanks that have been destroyed, given their issues around training, what do they have left? How much can they really do? I really want them to overstretch themselves, essentially, and then pay very badly for it. A bit like they did with the advance initially towards Kyiv. Perhaps it's wishful thinking.
Will
I'm
go ahead, Will.
I'll chip in here with what I know too from history. So the Soviet army or the Soviet military and the Russian military since then, because they haven't really changed things, is really about more is better, right? They produced tens of thousands of more tanks, the T-34 during the Second World War, than anybody else did. This time they produced tens of thousands of artillery pieces. They're heavy on numbers, right? And their tanks, the T-72, the T-90, that's why they have this auto loader and things like that. It's all about more. More is better. They can throw a lot more shells downrange quicker than the other tanks. But remember that accurate fire is worth more than inaccurate fire. So effective fire is what you're interested in. But the approach of the Soviet army has been to overwhelm its enemies in attritional warfare with massive amounts of artillery, and then overwhelming amounts of lower quality tanks and troops and armored personnel carriers to just essentially overrun you as quickly as possible. And that's what we see prosecuted here. The playbook is every place that Russia has been, that they've been successful, you see flattened cities, mass graves of civilians, and basically the oppression that they leave behind. They only know one way to do attritional warfare, and this is the way they always do it, by just absolutely saturating the ground in front of them with artillery, and then moving into that space once it's evacuated or all the people that are there killed. Now, Ukraine has done an exceptionally good job of giving up land for losses on the other side. But the problem is, well, the issue still is that Russia produces more tanks than all the other world combined. But do those tanks run? Do they have an engine? The stuff Daryl regularly talks about in relation to maintenance and operation of armored fighting vehicles. If you see something on paper, if you went and asked the Germans, how many Leos do you have ready that could go to war? You're going to get an honest answer. If you ask the Russian side, how many tanks have you got ready to go? They'll tell you how many tank bodies they could possibly count, but they'll count them all as ready to go, when in fact only a small fraction of those will be ready to go. And and they'll have less crews even than that to operate them. So they're still phenomenally dangerous because of the numbers of stuff they can throw into the field, but it won't. That will not win out in the end, as has been proven time and time again.
And Will, I think you're exactly right in focusing on numbers. Not only numbers of infantry, but numbers of artillery, numbers of mechanized vehicles, and that kind of thing. But there are a couple of things I'd like to point out. That Russia's ability to manufacture additional tanks, additional armored vehicles, it has really been degraded by sanctions. They don't have the material they need to continue manufacturing tanks, for example. There is a real question of whether or not their most advanced tank, the Armada, is even a real thing. I mean, we've seen armadas in military parades across Red Square. What happened? Those Armada tanks broke down and had to be towed away. We don't know how many there are. Russia suggested they were going to send them to the front. Uh, it's almost like sending I don't know a cardboard or a wooden tank to the front. We don't know what capability it has. We don't even know if it works or if it exists. Uh, and in any event, I'm just going to say the only thing Russia has to throw into this battle uh, is MOBICs, mobilized, poorly trained soldiers, and they can overwhelm a position, but they cannot win a war. As usual, Daryl, I find a way to stop the conversation every single time.
No, that was just me. Blame me for that one. No, I was just, we've been doing a lot of things here uh, on the space, and I'm just noticing, different numbers and things like that. And I just want to say, folks, you are doing a fantabulous job. Um, while we are here to make sure we get information out, it is you, the listeners, that we need to be thankful of. And the reason I'm saying thankful is because what we do here, and you go out and you gather other folks to come and listen. Um, think about the leopards. All of this that has gone on raised big flags. Yeah, it may have happened anyway, but who's to say that it didn't happen sooner? Because all of us, every one of you that are out there listening, had a voice into this process. If you wrote your PM, you wrote your senator, congressman, you wrote your consulate, whoever, and you did something. It is because we all here did it together. And I just, yeah, I'm trying to just say, you know, thanks to you, we keep going and we're growing, and uh, and we're going to try to make, our promise to you remain true, and that's to make sure that you get information, you get perspectives, you get voices here.
offensive is, to a great extent, a means to get the political side won for them. I mean, it wasn't an accident. I don't think that Scholz came out and said he's going to negotiate with the Russians again immediately after saying he'll send the tanks, and at the same time in which the Russians are starting to ramp up their offensive. There's just going to be one hell of a hard push, probably in the next, I want to say, 2-3 weeks to maybe 2 months, where they're just going to hammer the West with propaganda, with messaging, trying to divide, trying to get a cure, because they need a stop and cessation. They need to hold on to their gains. They need to regroup, and then they'll go back at it again. That is the one thing that we have to be constantly aware of. We being people who are in places like Maria Aid and Maria Reports, you need to be cognizant of that as you look at what they're doing. We get so hung up on this military device or that military machine or, this tactic or this strategy. That's not how Putin and those guys see it. It's all a political effort for them. They can't lose the war. They have to get enough done that we back off and go away so they can claim their prize. But we just can't let them do that. And so as all of this is going on, keep that in mind, because that's really what it's about for them.
Dryfly, I think your point is right on. Part of, and Dryfly is talking about a political strategy here. Part of Putin's political strategy is to wait out the West, to exhaust NATO, to rely on a belief that NATO and the United States and Western nations will simply grow tired of supporting Ukraine and walk away from this war. And we cannot allow that to happen, as Dryfly said. The very most that we can do here in MriyaReport is to encourage folks to be in touch with their elected officials, those who have a say in the United States and every European nation, in Canada, about how much we do to support Ukraine. President Zelensky gave a speech last night in which he talked about time. Chuck Ferrer talked about time in a different context earlier tonight, how you trade distance for time on the battlefield. But the point that President Zelensky was making, and that others have made, time is not necessarily on Ukraine's side. And President Zelensky said what Ukraine needs to do is to make time a weapon that works for Ukraine. Well, how can we do that? We can do that by assuring that every weapon Ukraine asks for, because they know what they need. Well, all the Western war planners know what Ukraine needs. We need to do our utmost to deliver those weapons, to use time on Ukraine's side. In other words, by making this war shorter and shorter and shorter, and as quickly decided as possible, not only because it saves Ukrainian lives, but because only in that way will time be on Ukraine's side. Finish the war just as soon as possible. And by finishing the war, what we're talking about is driving every Russian soldier, every Russian unit out of Ukraine. And so, Dryfly, you have refocused our discussion here tonight. I'll go back to you, and then to Will, and then to finance. Dryfly, thanks.
Yeah, and one quick follow up on that. I agree 100%. Time is currently on the Russian side, and we need to get it on our side. However, my thoughts are that it's even more complicated than that, because I don't necessarily know that Zelensky plans to push them out 100% using military force. He's indoctrinated enough, having grown up in this world, to know he may get what he needs via political means, meaning Russia may be the one who pulls out after Putin is faced with imminent defeat. But what has to happen is there has to be enough pain, economic, political, social pain on Putin that the Russians no longer want to fight. Period. And how we do that is through weapons. That's how you do it, through defeating them on the battlefield. You may not push them all the way to the border, but you'll push them so far that they want to leave, they want to end, and they will sue for peace on Ukrainian terms. And that's what we need to keep in our mind and not surrender unilaterally. And that's when I heard Schultz, it just drives me freaking crazy, because you can sense that's what he would like to do if he could. And I will listen.
Well, Ukraine has to defeat Russia decisively. They must defeat Russia decisively on the battlefield. That is the only way this war ends. And so maybe it means Russian troops are within miles of the Russian border and can retreat. But this war cannot end without a decisive defeat of Russia. It's the only way it happens. It's just the only way, Dryfly.
Yeah.
What Schultz is looking for, he's looking for economic power, economic source after this. And that's all he's thinking about. He's looking at, oh, wait a minute, if we crush him, we may have to deal with some rogue republic. That's what he's thinking about.
Someone's got a hot mic here. Dryfly, I think it's you. Are you making coffee or soup?
I'm actually washing some linens, believe it or not, from the holidays. My wife works 100%, so I do the laundry while she's at work, and we have a beautiful Scandinavian hardinger lace that somehow got stained, so I was working on it. But anyway, you guys are right, and yeah, I don't know how it's going to end, where on the battle line it's going to be, but the point is that you hit it right. They've got to be defeated. They've got to want out of this war, period. I mean, want out. Because if it's anything else but that, it's going to continue, because they're a big enough country, they can do it. And there's no way Ukraine is going to push them all the way back to Vladivostok. So at some point, they've got to stop wanting to fight. And how we get there, I don't know. But it's going to require some massive defeats on their part. And we've got to give them the weapons to do it. And I'll listen.
Let's see, Daryl. Do we know the order of hands? I think it's Will, Finance, and then Robert. Will, go ahead.
So, Dryfly, I believe you're 100% correct in relation to military doctrine, and I would also add to that I've done, because I lived in Russia, I was fascinated with Russia. I've done an incredible amount of reading. Well, I'm not a doctor or candidate, but I've done a lot of reading on Russia and its history and everything as a friend, right? Just curious about the place, and I can tell you that not only in the military side, but all the misinformation and everything of the manner in which they're trying to prosecute this war, so that we give up, so that the West gives up. The continued and repeated time after time again, raising the nuclear specter. They know what scares you. They're like Stephen King as far as information wars. And what amazes me is the amount of people that, the actors that they've got working in America and Australia and all over the world to try to the subterfuge that's going on to try to weaken the West's resolve to participate in this as time goes on and on and on. And you'll notice that as they get more and more desperate for a win, their actions are. I'm a no.
Did we miss Will?
But they're regularly attacking me and trying to take over my account and stuff like that on Twitter. If they're spending so much time attacking people, nobody's like me. Trust me, they're losing, and don't believe the garbage message. And when this war is over, when it ends on the battlefield with Russia suing for peace to capitulate and move back to the 1991 borders, I just want to remind everybody that the effort is not over, even when the war's over, because we've got to hold all these people to account who've been trying to weaken the effort on our side, and expose them for who they are and make everybody remember their positions and hold them to account afterward. Now, not like some police trial or whatever, but I'll tell you what, some of the stuff that's going on with, like, Mark Kelly, the former ambassador to Poland from Australia, those people really should be held to actual account, because they've got a lot of supposed credibility, and they are acting in the direct opposite of the interest of the Australian government. And I'm not down with that, frankly. And I'm not down with twerps like whoever this Jackson Hinkle guy is, and Kelly Lane, and these people in America who've got a soapbox, but they're not journalists. And we need to clean house when this is all over to make sure that this garbage doesn't rise again as Russia is isolated, and then hopefully either resolves itself, but that's a different discussion, or collapses into regions. Thanks.
Remember when there was a time back in the day when treason against the state during time of war was punishable by death?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to see those people killed, right? And I have goodwill to Russians that I know, provided they're not interested in supporting their government in the authoritarian government with imperialistic designs of the future. If they've got an honest desire to reform after this, great. But we'll leave all the sanctions on until such time as they demonstrate that change, rather than hoping they'll make that change, as Schultz apparently is looking to do, and get things back to normal economically. And I don't want the people in America and Australia killed or imprisoned necessarily, but I definitely want them deplatformed. I definitely want them named as bad faith actors in this discussion. And I wish the Australian government would step up and do that, because they're using their former Australian officialdom as their credibility to sow dissent and weaken our effort for liberal democracies.
I wish Schultz would recognize that Germany and the EU do not need Russia for any economic activity whatsoever. Zero. I mean, Schultz looks forward to a future where some kind of economic connection with Russia reforms Russia. We've already seen it won't happen. Inviting Russia in to the G7, making it the G8 or the G20, inviting them in to international organizations, into the rule of order that was established. It doesn't change Russia. It simply doesn't. So keep them out. Get them out, as we've done, and keep them out. No one needs to trade with Russia. It doesn't bring you profit in any way. It doesn't change Russia in any way. So just get them out of these international organizations. And honestly, if it could be done, kick them out of the Security Council in the United Nations. I don't think it can be done, but Ukraine's working on it. They have a very good idea. They didn't apply after the collapse of the Soviet Union to occupy that seat. So just get them out. That's all. I mean, you sent me off here, but you know. I agree with you. I just agree with you 100% and go beyond that.
Here's one thing that I want to add to this. We brought them in on the negotiations with Iran. Looking in hindsight, that was not the best move because now they are allies. They can never be a party to any agreement in that situation, um, especially with the current regime. If they go through a regime change as a result of some of the things that are going on within their country, I think we should look at it, but we should not have them party to it at all because it has not proven to be the wisest of choices. It may have looked like it at the time, but we see that there was a secondary line of communication open that we, of course, were not a party to it. Finance, you getting ready to jump in there?
Yeah, no, I actually think that on both of your last two comments, I am, especially Alan's comments, I'm in fact more cynical than Alan is. I don't think Olaf Scholz has any desire whatsoever to reform Russia. That is not his MO. I think that that might be what he says to politically save face because he says what he needs to politically. He is, of course, a politician. But if we watch what he does, he is dedicated towards trading and making money off Russia. And absolutely, there are people who are making money off Russia. German businesses and machine manufacturers and weapons providers who have been selling machine tools that drive 95% of their military industrial complex. And in fact, Rheinmetall, who built their one NATO standard training site. They don't have enough training sites, but they do have one that's up to snuff. It was more or less built by Rheinmetall. And they continue to send parts to a contractor after 2014 when they pulled out. So yes, while they said they weren't working in Russia after 2014, true, but they just sold it all to a cutout who then set it up for them. So at least Rheinmetall, unlike Siemens and Heiderhans, is more than happy to also supply Ukraine. So there's that. But no, Germany has absolutely profited off this relationship, and Olaf Scholz wants to keep it coming and doesn't give a flying frog if Ukrainian lives are killed for it. He has no spine whatsoever. He has no moral fiber. The Swiss banking system has made and will continue to make hundreds of millions and billions of dollars off of illicit Russian money. So, one, there are absolutely people who have made profit off of this industry. And unsurprisingly, the people where the profit is being made are often the people who are showing significant, steadfast pro-Russian ties, right? The Swiss neutrality certainly seems to many people to be heavily pro-Russian, favoring neutrality, which would make sense when you figure that their banking system, whose privacy laws are so extreme that to give up banking privacy, now that's a civil case here in the US and most of the world. In the Swiss, if you were working in Switzerland and you give up the name of a client and you work for a bank, almost doesn't matter why, that is a criminal felony. You go to jail, right? That is how their society, like they know how their bread is buttered in Switzerland. It's how they make their money. And a metric ton of Siloviki cash, right, found its way long before February, long before 2014, but continuing to this day, continuing after this war started into Switzerland. So one, there are absolutely people who are making money off it, and they continue to be on the pro-Russian side of the scale, at least slightly, if not heavily. The other side, as per what, so I just wanted to make that comment that I do appreciate exactly where you're going. I think that we must keep it on. We get to the same place of what we need to be doing, but I'm actually cynical that there's actually no desire to change Russia. Olaf Scholz is more than happy to trade somebody's lives for his own profit or freedom. Quite frankly, he should have been a minister in the German government in 1939, not today.
Harsh words. I don't disagree with you, Finance. And yes, you are more cynical than I am. Let Russia create its own economic sphere. What would that sphere look like? It would be North Korea, it would be Russia, it would be Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. I don't
And
even
India.
think, and no, Daryl, I don't think China or India or Pakistan would join. I really don't.
India will, maybe not for military industrial complex activities. India heavily needs more export partners. They were massively shunned from the US and from other Western trading nations for much of the post World War II 20th century, and had good relations with the Soviet Union, hence their non-aligned status. So I actually do agree with Daryl that India would trade, especially with the post-war Russia, especially for non-military goods, and tell the rest of the world, hey, the war is over, we moved on. And I agree that India shouldn't. I agree that this, that while India deserves plenty of blame for this position, that so do we all in the West, because had we integrated with India instead of China, had we done significantly more to trade with India, it's not like they don't want to do business in India, right? Like, I'm sorry, if y'all don't think that Indians like to do business, y'all haven't met any of the Indian people I've met. And that's both in India and out of India, right? Their expats like to do lots of business in India, right? It's a thing that they very strong business, culture, right? Very ancient culture. So I would say that I sadly agree with Daryl.
They don't have Social Security, Adam. Finance. They don't have Social Security.
There's a lot of things, that are different there than here. I'm just pointing out that, like, Indian expats, like, it is a hardworking culture, right? And it is a pro-business culture in all countries that Indians emigrate to and at home.
Yeah, I was just joking there. I was just saying, they don't have Social Security, so they have to create business in order to have an income for life.
And at the moment, I know India and Pakistan are buying a lot of Russian oil that can be exported. Uh, eh, but I just I want to believe. I have no basis for thinking this will come true, but I want to believe that countries like India will shun Russia and will draw closer to the West. And by the West, I mean the European Union, the United States. There is a lot of economic trade that needs to be increased, that needs to be enlarged. There's absolutely no reason that the economic sphere of trade it cannot embrace India more, cannot embrace Latin American countries more. It will draw them closer to international order and to the possibility of democratic nations, of democratic rule. That's just my opinion. It might be wishful thinking.
I would say that the opposite of, if Russia's going to act like North Korea, we should treat them, is that the countries who are democratic and that have human rights and that do these things, and India is one of them. You can disagree with their governments. You can disagree with a lot about how they run things. They are a democratically elected free people that gives, a pretty strong version, comparatively speaking, in the world of human rights to their people. And we are not treating them as such. We should be, and that's who we should be. That's exactly the kind of country we should be looking to deepen our trade ties with. So I would say on the opposite, right? And I could say that for a number of African countries as well. So I would say that, we should do our parts to say, hey, everyone who's a democracy, everyone that likes rule of law, everyone that's down for human rights, right? Our job should be like, let's do more business with them, right? Less with China, less with Russia. Let's look towards the people who are giving the moral fiber. There's lots of business to go around. Let's do it with the people, who have a backbone in the first place.
Well, one way we can do this is we set our tax structure, our the way we do business at home. We make it more profitable for companies at home to do business here and or with those businesses in preferred countries. Um, it seems that everybody ran to China to avoid US taxes and cheap labor. Yet they still took some of the advantages of our own tax codes. Now, I'm not saying that's for everyone, but we know that that happened a lot for companies that were operating in China and have been. And for that matter, even startups, it's actually easier for companies on that startup companies to get their goods manufactured in China. And if we can change the small customer, I mean the small business owners purchasing habit, then we can change the whole entire spectrum.
Again, the conversation here shifts all the time, and yet it remains focused on Ukraine and what can we do to help Ukraine resist this Russian invasion? What can we do to help Ukraine defeat Russia in the field decisively? And therefore end this war as quickly as possible. Well, when we talk about economics and world order and international rules, that also refocuses our attention on Ukraine because this is what they are looking to do to join the international world of rules and order. Uh, it, it, and you know, and to join NATO, to join the EU. By doing that, by reforming their own country and and driving out corruption, they are demonstrating to all of us Ukraine looks to the West. Ukraine looks to the EU. Ukraine looks to NATO. Ukraine is saying, uh, we're like you, we're family. So embrace us uh, and let's go into the future together. I just want to ask folks to please retweet Maria Report, bring other people here, join into the conversation. Go to mariaaid.org, MRIYA. AID.org, because we are talking every single day about what Ukraine needs, what Ukraine asks for. And one of the things they ask for, one of the things they urgently need, a continuing supply of humanitarian aid. And so when you go to mariaaid.org, you can make a contribution to keep the flow of humanitarian supplies, life-saving supplies going. mariaaid.org. Daryl, go ahead.
All right, and with that, Whiskey, you've been waiting up there so patiently. Good evening.
Thanks. Hey, good evening, Daryl, and good evening, Alan. I hope you guys are both well. Originally, I came up to just echo some of the comments that Dryfly made, but you guys, as always, have covered quite a bit of ground and just left me with a whole bunch of things that I would like to comment to. But just to keep it simple, I'd like to kind of like back up a little bit and go off of what Alan was just talking about Ukraine joining the EU, and if we go back in time, you know, Ukraine for more than a decade has been trying to get into the EU, and they were so close, and when.
Whiskey, did we lose you, or am I the only one who can't hear you? Daryl, can you hear Whiskey?
Nope. Whiskey, you have gone silent. Either he must have gotten a call. And just to say this, I'm gonna stay in my bailiwick. I'll let finance handle finance. I'll stay away from it. Anyway, Dryfly, go ahead while we're waiting on Whiskey, because I think he got a call.
shortly after that, we saw Crimea happen. We saw what was happening in the Donbass, and
Whiskey, whiskey. Can you hear me? Whiskey, can you hear me? Raise your hand.
You might just want to push him down so he knows to recycle, because I don't know, his connection's so bad.
Yeah,
I don't know if we can communicate to him otherwise.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. Yeah.
I could see now there's going to be like 400 DMs to the host going, "Why did you drop me? Do you guys not like me anymore?"
He should know by now. No, we don't like it. No. Go ahead, Draftfly.
Yeah, I'll keep it short so he can jump back in there. I just wanted to alert people that if you really want to wrap your head around how the Putin organization thinks, okay, go back and read history of how the Red Army was formed, how the Communist Party was formed, how Lenin thought early in the Soviet era. You know, like I'm talking 1917, even before the revolution, and then through the Civil War. I mean, Trotsky was basically the inventor of the Red Army. Dzerzhinsky was basically the inventor of what is now the KGB, which became the FSB. At that time was the Cheka. Went through a number of different iterations. Putin grew up in all of that. He was steeped in it. I mean, that's his Washington, his Lincoln. You know, he looks at the world through that prism. And when you understand that, you realize that every single thing they do with military, economics, all of it is driven by political expediency. The Homodor was a political move on the part of Stalin. I mean, it was something that they were going to crush Ukraine and the private farmers. And if they had to steal all the food to do it, they'll do it. Food was a weapon. It was a political weapon. So as you're watching this horror show coming out of Moscow, okay, toward Ukraine, understand that that's what they're doing. And then look back and see how they're handling Europe. They're handling Europe like they've always handled Europe, playing one side off against another, working the political angle. Their military is just a means to get that done, and they will do whatever it takes. So we just can't surrender. And I'll listen. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Draftfly. And yep, they played. They had quote unquote at one point there was a war. The Ukrainian Cossacks were rebelling, and they sided with Poland, and then they split. They split Ukraine at one point, and then there was a few times they did all of that. But anyway, let me go ahead. Let's go to Whiskey. He was in the middle talking before he was so rudely interrupted by Twitter.
Daryl, I think Whiskey came up and then dropped back down. I only see him as a listener.
All right. Well, anyway, okay. Let's see. I had Robert. Go ahead, Robert B. Robert B. Going once.
can
Going
can you
twice.
guys hear me now? Sorry, I'm having problems with this VPN.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Whiskey's back. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Where did you guys lose me at when I was on that trying to back up Dryfly there?
Yeah, we lost you in about 2021.
Okay. Oh geez. So not to repeat everything over again, but yeah, so after I'm trying to get my brain back wrapped around where you guys might have lost me versus where I'm at now, but yeah, so with what was going on in Syria, uh, some of the mistakes we actually made in dealing with that, you know, uh, Putin kind of he played a different card than what he was speaking to before, where he was very about propping up, like not interfering in, what sovereign countries wanted to decide for themselves, and he was very against that at that point. But then he suddenly switched, and then started bombing Syria. And Assad, he was definitely trying. Like when we talk about defeating Russia completely. We're not only talking, and Alan, I believe you were talking about this earlier, but we're not only talking militarily, we're talking politically, we're talking diplomatically, and we're talking physically, as in on the ground, against one force against the other. And I feel like that's, in the last decade, that's kind of where we've made some mistakes in dealing with Russia. Hindsight being 2020 and all, sure, we can see that now, but we damn well knew from what we saw in Syria what we should expect them to do in Ukraine. And, just with the bombing of the hospitals, and it wasn't just a mistake. A lot of you know political leaders reached out to Russia and said, "Hey, you're not bombing the terrorists. You're actually bombing the civilian population of Syria." And Russia's typical move was to admit to nothing, deny everything, and switch the blame to somebody else, switch the narrative. And it's the same tactic that we see, them doing currently today. Like nothing has changed uh, about Russia at all. And going back to what we saw, the escalations that we saw happen in Ukraine shortly after, what was it, the Sochi Olympics? I think it was like the day or two after that. That's when, uh, I could have my dates wrong here, but that's when basically Russia started rolling into Crimea. And they kept denying in their typical way, you know, don't admit to anything, deny and shift the blame, that they did not have forces in Crimea, even though the rest of the world knew that was false, that was a lie. Um, and so that happened. And then after that, we saw what was kicking off in Donbass. And, you know, with the will I think it was France and oh God, I think France, and there was one other diplomat that they worked all night to sign to get that Minsk agreement going, and that, I mean, just in typical Russian uh, manner, even when that was signed, when there was a ceasefire, they did not agree to that. The fighting kept going on. Um, Russia's never stuck to any of the deals or agreements that they have made. But going back to Ukraine, um, I think it was as early as 2014, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but they were asking for javelins. And javelin is a defensive weapon. And Ukraine was back in 2014, uh, Ukraine was very straightforward in what they said. We will not attack, um, a Russian tank, or we will not take out a Russian tank or Russian forces if they do not attack us first. Ukraine has been solid for almost a decade, more than a decade now, on where they stand. They just want to be a sovereign nation. And again, tying this back to where I started before I cut out, was, they were, for the most part, lined up to be into the EU before, what was it, Victor, again, I can't pronounce that traitor's name, uh, basically sold out the Ukrainian people to make a deal with Russia.
Yanukovych.
Yanukovych.
Thank you, Yanukovych. And then we had Maidan. So um, anyway, I tried to cover all the many thoughts you got. You guys are great. You guys covered a lot of ground in a small amount of time. The only other thing I wanted to touch on was limiting the materials actually going to Russia, and coming from like the tech background, I think it was Constantine that put out some photos earlier today from a Lancelot loitering munition, and a lot of the chips actually in that board, if that was actually belonged to a Lancelot drone, came, a lot of the major chips actually came from the West, came from US and I believe German, and I think it was a Swiss company. So, we have to tighten our belts, folks. And to echo what Finance was saying, yes, India would probably have been a much better choice. And I'm not completely educated on this, but India would have been a much better choice to go into business with versus China. I've worked with China in my past business experience, and they've never been loyal when it comes to copyrighted or protected patents or anything like that. And with that, I'll stop yakking into the microphone, and thank you guys. Please go on.
Thanks, Whiskey. And just to follow up on a very small point that Whiskey made, and I'm just going to pick this out of his comments. And this is what Russia signs, like the Minsk agreement. This is a good example. Any agreement Russia signs, Russia will not follow through with and honor. Now, all we have here at MriyaReport is words. We speak a lot. We invite all kinds of folks up here to speak, but our words and words of diplomats around the world, words of diplomats in the United Nations, have not succeeded in protecting Ukraine from destruction by Russia. Words did not save Mariupol. Words do not save residential buildings in Dnipro. Words do not prevent Russia from shelling Kharkiv and Kherson and Mykolaiv. But words are important. It's all we have. Words are the basis of international order when those words are honored. And nations who do not honor the words of treaties and international agreements have to be sanctioned. And so this is a way, eventually, after we get through a few more hands of Finance, to bring you back up. But there is still an opportunity to sanction Russia further. And as Whiskey said, to tighten our belts and to tighten the sanctions against Russia. And with that, my God, Daryl, we have so many hands. I have no idea what the order is. It could be Robert. It could be Al Kilo. It could be Will. Robert was up, so Robert, or help me out.
All right, we got Alex. He's been here for a minute. Then Robert, Al Kilo, Will. Yeah, I think that's got it. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. I wasn't here for some time, but there was another discussion in Twitter, and there are some guys. I think they believe they can teach others, the history of the region and whatnot, and they believe that we should give Crimea to Russia. But and I posted my response there too. But just think about these guys. Crimea, like people lived in Crimea for thousands and thousands of years, and it has no connection to Russia whatsoever. For the last 200 years, we are talking about like things that happened 100 years ago already, before two world wars and whatnot. So for 200 years, which is really a glimpse in the history of Crimea, This territory was occupied by Russian Empire, but keep in mind, but that was time when Russia Empire also occupied Finland, Poland, Baltic states, Southern Caucasus, Central Asia, and Alaska. So speaking of Crimea being part of Russia is like ridiculous. Like the notion itself is ridiculous. So either people, they know about everything as little as they know about the history, or they are kind of brain dead, or they take money from Russians. I don't know what to think, but like this is a ridiculous idea to now give Crimea back to Russia and buy peace with this. Like we've tried this so many times. Russia was extremely weak when Putin came to power. He was brought to power. He was allowed to come to power, and he was pumped up by the Western democracies because it was believed that that was probably a better choice. I don't know what people were thinking when they were like helping him grow into such arrogances that he started, threatening Boris Johnson and UK Prime Minister with a nuclear attack, on London or something. It's, yeah, basically, now they are asking how we can de-escalate or how we can, win peace. Well, you can't win peace through talking with Russians. The only point of sending diplomats is when they are willing to talk. And they will be willing to talk when you beat shit out of them. That's just as simple as it can get. Like it's a bully. You can't negotiate with a bully the terms for as long as he see you a weaker, in a weaker position. He need to be lying in the ground and begging for mercy. That's when you negotiate with bully. And you will negotiate, okay, I'll give you food and you give me all your nukes. That's gonna be the deal I'm talking about. It should be over, and just people need to wake up. Like international law does not work like, I am stronger, I'm gonna take this territory. And I'll come for whatever story I want to tell about it. It's not how it works. And by the way, to Americans, they have one narrative, but for everybody else, they are fighting against American-centric world. So all those things and stuff we call international law. For them, it's American-centric world. And what is Russian-centric world? Russian Mir, so-called one. Look at Mariupol. That is Russian Mir. That is what they are offering as an alternative to international law and debates and, United Nations and all those institutions. We need to protect our way of life. This is nothing less than that. This is about, being living the life we are living, or sitting to like where the whole world will be like Mariupol. Like who wants that? And this is so frustrating sometimes to see people so blind. But oh well. Anyway, I'm starting to rant now. I'll stop there and let other people speak. But I think it is important to kind of stay, and this is probably also to myself, to remain active. We can't give up. We can't go back to business until this is not over, and it is far from being over. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And so I think the order of hands could be Robert, Al Kilo, and then Will T, and then Whiskey. Robert, go ahead. Can you hear us?
I apologize. I could hear Daryl earlier, but Twitter wouldn't let me turn on my mic, so I'm sorry about that.
So, Robert, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. Daryl, is
I
Robert?
can hear him.
can
It's
hear
you,
him.
Alan.
Okay, go ahead.
Daryl, I think you were right earlier when you commented the tanks might have came anyway, but it would have been so long if we waited on the media and the diplomats. I appreciate everybody that did a ground root support and made a big difference. Every day speeded it up will save Ukrainian lives. So it should have been done months ago, but at least it's getting done now. My other comment was, from what you guys were saying earlier, we were wrong. We said Putin couldn't accomplish anything. It took Stalin years to decimate his officer corps, and Putin did it in 10 months. I'll drop down.
All right, we appreciate the comment, Robert. Yep, it's still everybody here, everybody that's listening, everybody that put in the effort. Um, consider yourself a part. We did the damn thing, and we wrote them and wrote them hard, and let's just hope it did the. It was that influence that tipped the scales. So give yourself a pat on the back. El Kilo, go ahead.
Hey guys, thank you. I really appreciate all the effort over here. I just wanted to say, like, 100% for what Dryflies just said. I mean, this is, I think, so important. I think we're pretty naive, and so the fact that there's this whole that the military aspect is just one part of it. There's this other, and they're so good at it. I mean, there's a lot of discussion how bad there are things, but I think underestimating your enemy sometimes is not a good idea. The non-military component is such an important part, and the waiting out thing is what they're pretty good at. I mean, and so I'm just going to give a vignette and of something I once heard, and I want to ask an opinion for Dryfly and Will about this. So, like several years ago, I was at a party, and there's this ex Eastern Polish apparatchik who told me the story that he went to somewhere in the Ural and got drunk with Russian officials. And it was at the time when the whole Katyn story came out, where Stalin signed off to kill 15,000 Polish officers during the Second World War. They were basically shot in the back in the head. And at the time, Russians were blaming the Germans and vice versa. And did you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Kilo.
At the time,
Kilo.
yeah. So at the time, so he was telling that the Russians were kind of like bugging him, like saying, "Hey, why you Poles are making such a big story out of this now?" And he said, "Well, that was a big deal. I mean, those you killed like the elite of the Polish army at the time, and it's a disaster. It was a disaster for Poland. I mean, this is like an apparatchik is saying this." And so the Russians were laughing and saying, "Hey, wait a minute, we killed 20 millions of our own people and we don't care." And to me, that story always struck that this is a different mentality. I mean, and I just want to ask. So that was just one vignette, and I just want to ask Will, who you live there, and Dryfly, what do you think about it? And maybe that's another thing that we got to be really careful that that's just a different mentality. People are going out there. It sounds crazy. It's like this drunken, semi-competent army that just keeps on sending these people to this butchery, and they don't seem to care, and they're going to wait it out, and it looks weak, but on the sum of things, they're just throwing this thing, and I think I totally agree with you, Dryfly. It's so important to stay on task for months to come. Keep the pressure on. They're going to keep that political pressure on to basically change the narrative, use all the means possible, divisive things, quote unquote, left versus right. It's just going to be going on. And I think what I think this space is doing is so important. So thank you very much. And I just was wondering, Will, when you're going to talk and then, and Dryfly, what do you think about that? That's in addition to what you said, Dryfly, there's also a different mentality. So I'm going to drop out.
Can I speak to that for just 1 second? Because I can add one thing that'll help them again clarify.
Sure, you go ahead. I'm just gonna give a bit of a reading list for people who are interested more in this.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that too. In fact, you might want to put it on a list and then send it to one of the guys and throw it up in the net sometime, because I need to review my reading. Most of my reading goes back to the 70s. I took a class in modern history, and the guy who taught it was actually a young person in the State Department before he went and got his PhD. He worked with FDR's administration at both, at all three of them, at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, and he was able to recollect the whole thing that went through. But anyway, the point was is that during that thing, I remember one of the readings we talked about it, and Lenin was being questioned about all of the false punishment that had been going on underneath Trotsky during the basically the reign of terror of the Red Army, and that there had been a lot of accusations that the Red Army was killing innocent people. And Lenin just looked at, and it might have been Dzerzhinsky or one of Dzerzhinsky's underlings, but he looked at him and said, killing innocent people does more to control the population by far than killing the guilty. And once you wrap your head around that, you understand all of the terror that went on in Syria, all of the terror that went on in some of the insurgencies they backed and how the guerrillas behaved, all of the terror that they're doing in Ukraine right now. They would much rather throw a missile into a complex of an apartment complex of innocent people, because it has a much greater effect than if you knock out a whole flat of Russian soldiers. The shock to the West is just off the charts. They don't care. It's all ends justify the means, or the ends justify the means. And so what you're seeing is standard Soviet tactics carried on all the way through past the Soviet Union. And you could say, well, it's the Russian way of doing things. It may be, but I think it's actually was amplified greatly during the Civil War and the ideology and indoctrination by people like Trotsky and Stalin and Dzerzhinsky and Lenin. And until you really read some of what they thought, how they acted, and conversely, if you're looking at China, look at how Mao behaved. Okay, and his I can't remember his foreign minister. Was it Lin? Something anyway. Those two guys were the brainchild behind the Red Army or the People's Liberation Army. Those tactics, that philosophy, the way they do business is the way it's still done. And they've just changed names. And until you wrap your head around that, you're not going to understand. And so to try to negotiate on Western liberal democratic terms with that kind of ideology is just a fool's errand. And I'd like to hear what Will has to say.
Thanks. Am I up?
Yes.
Hi, yeah, we just had a co-host swap, so welcome. I'm Finance. I'm joined by Anda from Europe. We'll be taking it till the rest of the Europeans wake up to kick me out, and we'll be taking it for the rest of the day. That should be in about 3 hours. It is currently 9:17 p.m. Central Standard Time in the United States and Canada, and that makes it 8 hours ahead. Is Cube time, I believe, right? So I believe we are currently at 5 a.m. Cube time. Correct me if I'm wrong here. And yes, yeah.
Yes,
And
you're not wrong. It's 5 a.m. and 18 minutes past.
Perfect. All right. Yeah, you were listening to MriyaReport. We have a couple new co-hosts in. Thank you to our old co-hosts. We're all volunteers here. Alan has been going, burning the candle at both ends a bit. So hopefully he can go grab a drink, grab some sleep, grab some great food, whatever he's doing. And yes, Will, please respond. Let's keep this conversation running. We're having a great day.
Cool. So, Alan, to your point, that it's all just about words here. But in the words of Tom Morello, know your enemy. The point I want to make is that a lot of what Dryfly is saying, almost all of it is 100% accurate from my perspective as well. And don't take my word for jack shit, right? I do, but I'm going to point you toward a couple of things you could read for the purposes of, if you're a reader, knowing what they're going to do next, right? Because that's what I want to know about what Russia's going to do from what I know, and try to head off in the misinformation space as little as much as I can. What I know they're doing, because I see you there, right? There's tons of times I've looked at this stuff in the last year, and man, I see what you're doing, right? I wrote about it in the second week of the war, and almost all of what I said back then is come true because I read some of these books and was fascinated with Russia while I was living there, and I was a Cold War baby, right? In 1991, when the wall came down, the Soviet archives became open for the first time. And the Soviet archives contained the Nazi Party archives and the archives from the Reichstag that had to do with the civil administration, including the camps. So Western historians got their first opportunity to read all these things that were hidden from them for 40, 60 years, whatever it was, and some incredibly good books that shine a light in an area that was impenetrable when you were growing up in the 80s. All you knew was the Soviet Union, big, scary, bad, not really why, right? Just because it was incomprehensible. That authoritarian regime, like Russia today, doesn't actually want you to know what's going on inside its society, nor does it want its population to know what's going on. And what the books that I'd recommend to you are some books from a lady named Anne Applebaum, because she wrote a book called Iron Curtain and about the gulags. But Iron Curtain in particular will point to you exactly what they were attempting to do in Kiev in 3 days, because it's modeled after the Czech uprising response in 1968, and how, because it failed, and I would suspect some of the Ukrainian folks at the time had known what they were the methods they were going to do, and countered that. So hopefully they did. And Anthony Beevor has written some books about military stuff, in particular, like Stalingrad and the way they ended the war in Berlin, and that points to exactly the modus operandi that is being carried out by the Russian army now. I don't know if it was justified or not, but everybody knew about it, and the Russians raped, pillaged, and murdered their way all through Poland and Western Europe, and this is where they, then they killed all these soldiers in Katyn, right? They dominated in that way. They accept things that are genocide as part of their modus operandi because of, like what Dryfly said, their entire military operation is a politically driven thing in a way that you can't comprehend unless you understand the former Soviet Union. And then the last guy I want to recommend to you, because it goes to what Dryfly was just recently talking about, is a guy named Simon Sebag Montefiore, who wrote Court of the Red Tsar, Young Stalin, and he investigated the relationships all through the Tsarist period, all through the Soviet period, and demonstrates how it's just a continuum. They never changed anything in the way they run things at the top. It's been running the same way since Ivan the Terrible 1,000 years ago, and so I suspect if anybody reads those and comes up based on what they're seeing and they're observing, don't listen to me. What you see and you observe should drive what you decide you're going to do on the basis of what you've looked at in the past. And I think that there's things that we can identify in what's going on in the Ukraine and what will go on in Russia afterward. That'll be very, very helpful for us to know this most recent past, or from what we found out in the recent past about all these events back in the Second World War. Thanks.
Thank you. Whiskey, the lone hand remaining.
Okay, well, I'll try to follow up to that, but just to echo a little bit about what Will was saying, the strategies or whatever that Russia has actually been doing. We actually been seeing this as recently as Syria, or going back to Syria. They don't, I brought this up earlier. They were bombing civilians in parts of Syria that were not strongholds for the terrorists in that, and they denied it. They shifted the attention and blame and such, like they usually do. It's a it's a regular Russian tactic, but they've eventually came out and said, "Well, we're actually doing this because there's Chechens actually in this area that we don't want them coming back to uh, this area of our country and rising up against." And the reason why I bring that up is it's the same old from Russia, where they're trying to prop up uh, the people that are the dictators and such that are actually for them, like Assad and such. So, um, the bombing of the hospitals, like the reason why we're all here today is because I'd like to believe that none of us want to see small children who cannot defend themselves uh, being uh, blown up and hurt by this war of aggression. Um, it disgusts me, whether it's Syria or Ukraine currently. Seeing these families like torn apart, seeing these small children who haven't even had a fucking chance to live, like going through like these horrendous wounds, and their families who are just trying to go about their daily business being torn apart. Um, that's why I that's why I still am here. That's why I still plug in, because I'm fucking tired of seeing this. I'm tired of seeing Russia's aggression towards a sovereign nation uh, doing what they do, because they have this old school mentality of restoring this Soviet regime. It's just disgusting. Um, yeah, with that, I don't have anything else to say. I'm just gonna drop down. I'm sorry.
All right. So, indeed, it's a disgrace what's happening, and it's a disgrace the fact that children and civilians, men and women, have to suffer, all all ages, right? There are some old women or men which remained in Ukraine because they didn't have the means to leave, and they suffer, right? So it is indeed one of the reasons for which we are here. Christo, sorry, no, you're Christopher Michael. I mistaken. I how do you say finance when you look at someone and you mistake him with someone else? Anyway, I'm sorry. Sorry for
Not a problem. I get misidentified all the time, I promise you. Mic check 1 2 1 2. Everyone can hear.
you.
Loud and clear.
Alrighty. So a little backstory. I was one of the lucky kids on the planet. My grandfather was in the government in South America, Guyana, forestry secretary, and we got our independence in 1964 from the crown. And he was forestry secretary, and I've always had a government part of my life. And being so, coming to the States, being born in New York, and I got funneled through the magnet school program, international baccalaureate program. So I guess I look to instill hope that worldwide there are still people being educated from places like Switzerland and Sweden and Brazil and South America, and have a world point of view that are still being trained almost like the good Jedi Knights of the world. They had us read books such as Lenin's Tomb and China Wakes at the age of 14. I'm 35 now, so there's an entire generation that knows what the fuck is up. Sorry for cursing. I know it's I'll go to the after hour law. So all of that being said, yeah, logistics application. I'm on the channel quite a bit. I'm a good listener. I've learned to pay my dues, and I learned so much from all of you. Priceless information that I live my life as this war can come to our door tomorrow, and what then? And that's why I fight as hard as I do to push them back to where they belong and keep it that way. If they want to wreck themselves, go for it. If they want to do that, go for it. I'll share a little bit of a romantic tale. My first girlfriend in college was Russian. And this year, all of a sudden, she went missing. So who knows what happens with that? So with that, V for Vendetta, I'll drop down.
All right. Thank you for adding to the conversation. Interestingly, Christopher, do have an interesting panel up here. We'll can help with our military questions. We have Alex Carpelli, our resident Georgian, Robert B., I believe a military veteran, if memory serves. Robert, and from Romania originally. Are you Romanian?
Yes.
If memory serves.
Yes, I am.
All right. And I'm coming to you from the middle of America as our finance expert on the panel. So we have a wide variety of questions we're happy to answer. You're welcome to PM us, of which, hold on, I have a PM. All right, actually, question came in on PM. So a listener has asked me, and I get this question a lot, and it frustrates me a lot because it's this weird cockroach zombie. And the question is, can't Russia evade sanctions with BRICS? There's a lot of questions around BRICS. This stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the question presumes that there is some sort of treaty or agreement between these four countries. So originally the term BRIC was not a treaty. It's not an international organization. It was originally created by an investment bank, BBVA specifically in Latin America, to try to drum up funds for their emerging market division. And this was this is pre-2014. I want to say this was 2011. It might have even been 2008. I can't remember where I was career-wise. Like, I was out of college when this came out as a marketing thing, and it worked decently well for them to increase their profile. And they said, basically, these are the four major frontier markets that we think are joining sort of the more developed world, and that there's a lot of opportunity in these four places, and that's what makes them similar. Well, it's 14 years later, and there is no major treaty between them. Like, this isn't a military union. It's not a customs union. It's not a major diplomatic union. It's a trade group, right? What it is really just now there's Russian propaganda has bizarrely picked it up, suggesting that BRICS is a thing when it's just like not. So you'll see headlines like Saudi Arabia asked to join the BRIC. You'll hear same things for insert Latin American country will be added to BRICS. And this is coming out of Russia, except all it is now is once a year, Russia, there is a diplomatic junket and a bunch of ambassadors that, unless you really follow ambassadors, no one really knows about, all go to Russia. They have a weekend. They have a photo op. They leave. This is not high-level ministers. They have not created a trade union. They have not created a customs union. There is not some great cultural exchange going on between these four countries. So while, yes, there are significant things going on with bilateral trade or not between Russia and China, what exactly is going on between Russia and India is interesting. Brazil, I'm sure all of our listeners know, geography is halfway around the world from this conflict. And outside the fact that they have a ton of their own problems and would love to pull their heads out of their rumpus and get their economy back on track, really aren't involved particularly in this conflict in any direction. They're not a major military supplier to most, like they're not a major world military supplier. They do have a bunch of oil. Their state-run oil companies having significant issues for many years due to accounting scandals and corruption and fraud and all sorts of stuff. So there's no BRICS that exists. So what makes it frustrating is it's just a disinfo narrative. Like it has more power in the disinfo space than it does in reality. There is no existence of a thing in reality. So people are like, well, won't this help Russia evade sanctions? How? What? Who? Russia would still need to organize to evade sanctions, you know, like a trade agreement with somebody. There is no four-way trade agreement. You keep having ridiculous suggestions like Russia will create a common currency with Iran as one. And again, you don't need an MBA to see just how ridiculous this would be. Peter Duran correctly said today that please do this, Russia, because one common currency of Russia and Iran. Well, we could just sanction one currency at a time. Even better if they can both print all the money they want so they can both corrupt it from here to kingdom come, right? Like all it's going to do is cause problems and make our lives easier without solving any of them. So BRICS was literally an investment banker's way of drumming up business and does not have any broad existing cross-country agreement for anything, not diplomatic, not political, not military. It could in the future, but they'd have to build it, and no one has yet, right? It exists far more in people's heads in the disinfo world. So that did come in from a listener. That's what I've got, and I will kick it over to Anda.
So, on the border of your answer, I have a question for you. Actually, several, but let's start with the first one. So, let's entertain this idea that they could do something. Let's look at the economies of these countries. So, you have Brazil, which, how big of an economy do they have at this point? Are they stable enough, able enough? Do they have enough to actually help Russia? I'm not talking right now about political will. I'm talking about economical capability, right? Because you have behind Ukraine some countries with some strong, stable economies, which push further products, equipments, and help. Who does Russia have behind?
So right now, Russia's trade with China is increasing. It's significantly. It is mostly low-end trade. Some of the stuff Russia really needs, like computerized machine parts and semiconductors, China also is not known to make a lot of. So China will struggle to make a lot of for similar reasons to how Russia struggles. But it's only similar. I don't want to push this analogy too far. It is a different place with a different government, different institutions, and a different cultural structure. Right? India is actually more interesting because India really wants more export markets to build more stuff, like to build more manufacturing things that they can export. And Russia really wants more people to import anything but oil from them. And India would love to import oil and export anything else. So there is some natural reasons why those two countries might wish to trade. Again, this would out military sphere. I have said a few times, and thankfully this has not occurred yet, or it has not occurred, that one of my concerns would be that Russia, to help fix its major logistics problems, would just go try to buy, 500 or 5,000 lorries from India, right? Have every vehicle maker in India just making big old lorries, but Russia and India might attempt to say, this isn't a military vehicle, it's a lorry, guys. We all know that that would be not true, but that was my fear. That hasn't happened. I don't know if it's that most of their engines are made in Japan. The car makers in India that make these things, I looked that up. I don't know if it's that India isn't willing to get involved and they would think that's too involved. That's also very likely. There's a lot of possibilities here. I don't know if Russia hasn't thought along these lines and would consider that buying an Indian lorry is beneath them, that they're literally too chauvinistic to do it. Completely possible. This is Russia we're talking about. And, as the Ukrainian soldier says, it's a good thing they're so stupid. But that has actually been one of my concerns, because India would love to sell manufactured products for anyone. We know that they are importing Russian raw oil, at least have many, many times during this war. But yes, no, Brazil, they're halfway around the world. They don't share a border. Maybe there could be some sort of financial money hiding, whatever, but even all of that is not going to be as big a help as the actual physical movement of material in and out of Russia is. That's where the bottlenecks are. It's a lot easier to find somebody to take some illicit money anywhere in the world. You don't need a country for that. So I would say, Brazil, not that interesting. India could be, but hasn't done the thing that would really worry me as of yet. And if anything, has stayed out of it more than I was concerned they might. Their rhetoric is not always so positive on the conflict. I've been dismayed by that. But they also have absolutely bought a ton of Russian petrol product, but they have not exported. We've seen some increase of exports, but it's more stuff like, H&M clothing, gray market consumer goods. What we haven't seen is the big heavy industry and heavy stuff that the Russian economy is lacking. And that could either, as I said, that could be Russian chauvinism. It could be India unwillingness to export. India is incredibly bureaucratic, so somebody watches everything in India is the other side of that. So, they call it the red tape Raj. It is part of the reason their economy is more held back than it should be. But there is an upside to being that bureaucratic. Like, hey, trying to get people to do, something that is politically a problem, if their government doesn't want it, then that's going to be difficult. So of those countries, and we of course know that China is sending them some things that work for their military industrial complex. Repairing rail cars, we believe they're doing. We believe they're sending them optics for tanks, but they clearly aren't sending them tanks. And depending on if you think the North Korean shells are Chinese or not, we don't think they're sending them ammunition. We do know they're sending them ghost cargo planes daily, as well as other not as hidden means of transport and trade to and from Russia that has increased. And I think that answers your question, Anda. And Heather has her hand up. Heather.
Good morning, finance, and good morning, Anda. I feel like I just
Evening. I'm in America.
good evening. I'm in America too. It's evening for me too. But Anda, I feel like I just told you to go to bed 3 hours ago.
Something like that. And in the meantime, I woke up as Daryl was a co-host, and I came up because it was a really interesting discussion, and I fell asleep. So I don't even know when and if I dropped. I hope I didn't snore. So that's that's my only hope. So yeah, I got some hours of sleep.
Good, 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 good. Now, I have one more quick question before I go on to my real thing that I wanted to ask you about because it was very fascinating earlier. Second question: did you get a coffee pot?
Yes, I did. I did.
Good girl. I'm
I'm
so
a
glad you got.
yeah. I'm a proud owner of a French press. It's awesome. It's really awesome, and I'm really happy about it. And yeah, life is good. Life is good again.
We are all happy that you have gone and purchased a French press because Anda on coffee in the morning is much better than Anda without coffee in the morning. Now, I really enjoyed what you were said earlier today when you were speaking, and I see that you tagged my line here. 1-800 fix my arty. And so I was wondering if you would like to explain to the people what I dubbed 1-800 fix my arty, because it is a very interesting and fascinating thing to look at, and it's a very good move for both the Ukrainians for the Ukrainians.
So just before I went to sleep, I saw a piece of news about um, an artillery hotline. No, you don't call there to say we want this number of howitzers, but you call there to say something like, look, this is a picture. It's been blown up. What do I do now? And someone from the other side, who actually is from the U.S. military, will answer to your question. And we had some fun before I went to bed on this topic. Up until now, so a couple of months prior, if I understood correctly, there were like 50 servicemen who were helping with this. I like to joke and call it a hotline, an artillery hotline. This is why I put that 1-800 fix my RT, because I liked this catchy phrase of Prince. So it's provisioned that in about a month or two there will be about 150 servicemen who will actually who will help with this. It's not exactly it's not a phone number. It's that was just a joke. It's a sort of a chat room in which Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines or behind the front lines who need help with U.S. equipment, but not only. They can access that information by asking people who actually know what those pieces of equipment look like and how they work and how you fix them and so on and so forth. And I thought it's a really, so we have seen in the past months, weeks, but months in general, Ukrainian soldiers finding interesting new ways in solving big or small problems. We have discussed here in the space 2 days ago, I think, about the nets, which the artillerymen put above the howitzers, for example, because it's also about the howitzers. That was, I think, CJ's thread. And those nets, which are not heavy or not difficult to put up or take down, they actually can catch Lancet loiter munition. So basically, even if the Russians have, for example, some Orlan drones, and they see where you have stationed the howitzer, and lately they actually don't move as much as they did. So they are more exposed. They shoot with Lancet drones, but they don't reach the target because the howitzers are protected with these nets. So I will try to put in the nest the two articles we are talking about for everyone to see. And yes, it amused me to no end, and I really wanted to know if CJ ever fixed the howitzer on the phone. You know, like when I call my cousin and say, you know, all the witnesses. I don't know how are they called. The little so in my car, on the dashboard, if something goes wrong, you have a small light in a certain shape which lights up.
Yes.
They are called witnesses in Romanian. I don't know how to call them in English. What's the correct word for them? But I had at some point all of them. They were like lit up, and I called my call a friend. I called my cousin. What do I do now? um, and I was wondering if someone from the front lines actually uh, got to call. Um, um, it, or the joke was if CJ was ever called to fix a howitzer remotely, um, more or less. Uh, so yeah, that was the point.
Yeah, I wanted to point out a couple of more things that I think were interesting here. Um, they're all on encrypted chat lines, and since the fall, the number of encrypted chat lines has increased from 11 to 38. So they're getting more and more of them. And there was there was one there's one phrase in here that just made me giggle even more. It's where they say a lot of times we'll get calls from right there on the firing line at the same time as you're trying to help the forward maintainers troubleshoot the best they can. Somebody said from the repair brigade. And then also, according to him, the chat sometimes has to wait until the excuse me, Ukrainian military moves to a safer place. So that's how close to the front lines they are. And I would bet that maybe CJ has done some troubleshooting from the front lines on some of the artillery. And I just think it's a fabulous idea. I'm so happy and excited that they're doing it. And I'm really happy that you talked about it earlier today and that you repeated it for me tonight. But I have talked too much today, so I am going to drop down to listener and just say good morning to Anda, good evening to finance, and good morning, good day, whatever, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Prince, for coming up. And indeed, it's a very lovely story and hopeful story, right? So we got to learn, search for solutions, right? Good morning or good evening, David. You know,
Good morning.
good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I had a couple of points on the finance side of things. Yeah, the bricks, first of all, I guess. Is it all right? Do you want to go into something else, Ander, or?
No, it's perfectly all right.
Ask away.
Yeah, so just first thing, just to back up kind of the bricks stuff. Bricks is a kind of a nothing, and as finance pointed out, it's basically a trick to sell more bonds from the emerging markets by investment bankers. I actually thought it was Goldman Sachs that had triggered all of that, but glad to be educated on who it in fact was. Certainly, Goldman Sachs were very active in promoting BRICS.
Yeah,
as an idea
Goldman would have happily come up with it first, but they didn't. But once it started selling, there's no copyrighting on something like that. So,
No,
there's basically no
they-
copyrighting in finance. So, the bankers who could sell EM sold a bunch, but BBVA it helped their business too. But yeah, absolutely, it caught on fire with investors. So then investment bankers at all the shops started selling it.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, this kind of feeds into the tanky narrative of multipolar world, which is basically a load of nonsense. And one thing which kind of underlines the fact that it is a lot of nonsense is, well, two things. One being the kind of alliances that you see in the financial world and sanction avoiding by Russia and Iran. And the second thing is the semiconductor technology. So really the collective West has got pretty much, I would say, a stranglehold on the semiconductor business. It's one of the reasons why China is so keen to invade Taiwan, is because the biggest semiconductor manufacturing company in the world is based there. It's TSMC. And to give you an idea about the degree to which the West is ahead in this regard, that you talk about semiconductor technology in terms of nanometers. So kind of state of the art now with Western technology is 5 nanometers. Russia is talking about having 28 nanometer technology by 2030, and frankly they've got a snowball's chance in hell of actually getting anywhere close to that, and China's not much better in terms of what they can actually do. Another thing that's helped support that is that I'd say the world semiconductor business has moved even more towards compliance with whatever the US does. I should, but I don't know really what Germany's up to in this space. But yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, Japan and the Netherlands came out saying that they would comply completely, 100% with restrictions on delivering semiconductor technology to China. And China's of relevance here for, I guess, slightly obvious reasons, but just to restate it, China's a massive backdoor into the Russian economy, and obviously what happens in Russia-Ukraine has a pretty big impact on how China behaves. So yeah, so there's an overall context there. The other thing was that in terms of backdoors through the sanctions, there are, I'd say, 5 countries which are really relevant. So basically ignore the BRICS part and concentrate on these ones would be my kind of message. Sorry. sorry about that. Iran, and I would say Iran, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar probably as well. That general area, with the exclusion of Saudi and Yemen, Turkey, China, and India. So Iran we kind of know about, but Iran's basically as much of a basket case as Russia is, almost. Turkey's a real worry because they're very well integrated into the Western economy, but they're also very open towards Russia. And I know a number of businesses that have basically, let's say, virtualized themselves and become Turkish companies in the process. So that's a concern. That kind of let's say virtualization of the Russian economy is another issue, which I'll come to immediately after this point. And then you have China and India, and I'm less concerned about India and China for the reason that what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia is having a strong retaliatory effect on China. I mean, China is going to act in its best interests, and its best interests in the medium term, certainly not allying itself with Russia. I think we need to do a lot more in that regard. But nevertheless, just the economics of the China-America kind of pairing, it's pretty hard to see China doing anything to really damage that. I mean, finance, you probably know these numbers better, but China owns a vast amount of T-bills, which are government bonds of the United States. It, in theory, has the power to kind of dump those, and this is something that the tanky narrative often brings up.
Yeah, so this is a common misunderstanding of the bond markets. One, China actually has been slowly paring their bond holdings. So their holdings of U.S. government bonds have been pared below $1 trillion. That was last year for their first time in something like a decade. So they're actually moving away from holding as many U.S. assets. The U.S. government bonds have all performed absolutely horrifically since the start of 2022. Has nothing to do with China. This just has everything to do with inflation. Inflation rearing its ugly head can do infinitely more damage than if China were to attempt to sell every single bond at once on one day. It would not have done anywhere near as much damage as inflation did. In fact, the market would have a problem for a day or a month, and then it would absorb the supply, and the Chinese would have shot their bullet, and the real economy wouldn't even shudder, quite frankly, because, this gets to be a pretty esoteric part of our world. And once the mortgage rates snap back in about a month, we'd be fine. But, mortgage rates going from 2 to 6% or 7% here in the US due to inflation, and that being sitting up there for a long period of time, that is a significantly bigger issue than anything the Chinese can do with their bond holdings.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was kind of my point, that the
right,
the,
yeah.
the
And
bond
so, yes,
holding.
but I'm where you seem to realize that, but it can be hard to understand for those not versed in the bond market, because it seems like something that sounds really bad, which is why that one sticks so hard in the disinfo world. But basically, from the bond trader perspective, it's like, yeah, please sell it all. We don't care. This is not going to affect our national well-being.
Exactly. I mean, they hold those bonds for selfish reasons, and they're not about to dump them on the market for reasons that would affect them anyway. As you said, they're paring back on their US investments, but that's something which is basically going to shoot them in the foot, and something which they'll reverse anyway at some point in time. But the main point about China is that the whole economy exists because it's making stuff for America, essentially, but also for the rest of the world. But it can't afford to lose the US market for its manufacturing businesses, because the manufacturing businesses basically make stuff for America, and most of what they make is stuff they couldn't make on their own. They're very good at doing knockoffs of things. They're in the Japan in the early 1960s stage, I would say, in terms of what they can do. But basically, the West's still got a stranglehold on things in that regard. What's more concern is this virtualization of the Russian economy, which I spoke about earlier, and that's something that's been going on really since Soviet times, if not before. So the Soviet security services were already fairly well versed in setting up front companies offshore to get up to their various nefarious activities, and this has continued in a much bigger way since the fall of communism, and it's really difficult to tell, therefore, how much effect sanctions are having on the Russian economy in total, because so much of it is in fact completely offshore already, and always has been. So I mean, I was doing business in Russia in the 90s, and you know, it was normal practice that basically the transactions were held in London or offshore completely, to